Good morning and welcome, everyone. First, I'll acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, and that a lot of the work that we've been doing with respect to modeling in IMPC has been in the Sask Delta in the last couple of years, and that's treaty areas 4, 5, 6, and 10, which all kind of actually converge where the Delta is. I also want to acknowledge my home territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, the Mississauga Nation, because a lot of the experiences I had growing up in that territory have influenced where I am today and why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. So I'm going to start off with a short, about 10-minute presentation, then I'll pass it over to Tim, then Tim will pass it over to Pouya, and then Pouya will pass it over to Ana. And then we'll open it up for questions in about 45 minutes or so. Can you see that screen okay? All right, so I'm going to tell a few stories about some of the modeling work that we've been doing and some of the things that we've learned about collaborative modeling over the last decade. And I hope to share some insights from collaborative modeling and how modeling can help us identify priorities, for example, around flood and drought resilience, hazard mitigation or restoration activities, expanding data collection through citizen science and how that can feed into models, experimental decision labs using various modeling tools, and then learning the limitations of our models. And the key point I want to emphasize is that all models tell stories. And what can we learn from those stories that the models tell us? So first off, this example is a project that we did with Mistawasa Snehiawak in Treaty 6 territory. This is part of the Prairie Water Program, which is also Global Water Futures. And this work was done by a master's student, Anuja Thapa. And the idea behind this was to understand if we could learn what we learn from modeling. So this is the triple loop learning model you see on the right-hand side. Are we doing the right things? And as we understand that, we can ask, are we doing things right? And then as we understand that, we ask, how do we decide what is right? And that is sort of the process that we go through as we're developing models, in particular, when we're developing them with stakeholders and rights holders. So in this case, it was a multi-step approach, which used a social science tool called fuzzy cognitive mapping or mind mapping. And as we went through each stage, people added new bubbles and new links to this mind map. And we also used aerial photographs and a flooding model called WDPM, or the Wetland DEM Ponding Model. And what we could understand from that was what parts of the community are at risk from flooding or fire. And in the end, after going through this multi-step phase, we found that people identified in the first phase of drawing that mind map to the final phase of drawing that mind map, one of the areas that increased as the most important was emergency planning and practicing emergency planning. And so that was something that came out of Anuja's model. And so we began developing these tools with the community, which led to a next phase of actually, sorry, my mouse isn't working, of doing sustainable hazard mitigation. So developing tools with the community that came out of this modeling work to understand how to practice emergency procedures for flood, fire, and drought. And this is also going to be going on with other Indigenous communities on the prairies. But sometimes we don't have good enough models to be able to really tell us what's going on. And a lot of the reasons for that is that we don't have very good data. So one of the things we're working on concurrently with all this collaborative modeling work is distributed water science, which is building application tools for people to be able to collect data in a variety of different contexts and then upload that data to a server. And it uses blockchain so that the data is heavily encrypted, and to be able to share that eventually to upgrade models, because we don't have monitoring stations everywhere we need them. But the work that Tanvi Jain is doing is to develop the infrastructure so that people can use their smartphones to collect various forms of data and link it to some of those observation stations that are already out there. But do these models help us make decisions? And does this data help us make decisions? Well, we're trying to find this out through a set of tools called experimental decision labs, where we actually use models and scenarios to help people make decisions. Sometimes the information that they see is randomized. So we try to understand, do they prefer scientific information? Do they prefer stories? Do they prefer modeling outputs? And how does that influence the choices that they make as they go forward? So here's just a few examples of a recent scenario that we did. And what we found is that the preferences among a group of an audience of about 120 people were quite varied. They were quite balanced. But the reason this is important is because we want to know, do people actually trust the models that we're building? Or do they trust their existing forms of information more? And what we've learned is that we have to build the models with people so that they can actually feel like they were part of the development process and that they actually trust the model. They trust the information that's going into it because they've been a part of its development. So here's another example of participatory water quality modeling in the Qu'Appelle Valley, where we worked with a group of food producers and they sorted the beneficial management practices that they felt would have the biggest impact on improving water quality. And by doing that, we drove an existing model called Sparrow using those BMPs that the farmers thought were the most effective. And we learned from this that we were missing an important part of the story. After developing this model over about a year and presenting it back, and you can see some photos of us working with the food producers there. They're playing with the model, they're tweaking different parts of the model, and they're asking us questions. But in the end, they said, we really like this, but what we need to recognize is that there's also a very important economic dimension to our decision-making. We want to know if we invest in a beneficial management practice, how is that going to affect our production? And also how is it going to affect the overall water quality in the sub-basin where we work? So all of these models that we've been working with, and I've just shown a very small snapshot of a few, they tell us stories. And the influence of these stories can be pretty important on decision-making. And I mentioned this because we had Ashley Duffy, who's now going to be working with IMPC over the next year, working to understand how stories influence decision-making in source water protection. And what she found is that stories that are told in informal settings can actually have more of an influence on decisions than those that are told in formal settings. And so often when we present our models, we present them in kind of a formal setting, like today in PowerPoint presentations. So we have to think about how do we bring our models out into the world so that people can actually use them in the context in which we're applying them. So with that, I'll just say that we're going to hear from Tim next, and then from Pouya, and then from Ana-Piecie about the collaborative effort that's been done for modeling to restore the Saskatchewan River Delta. And there's a number of partners I want to acknowledge here: the Northern Village of Cumberland House, Cumberland House Cree Nation, Métis Local 42, as well as the Cumberland House Fishermen's Co-op and 90 trappers and 28 trappers, and the Delta Stewardship Committee, who we've been working with since 2013. And some of the folks who I've just mentioned have seen some of the models that you're about to hear about, but not everybody has. And we're hoping over the next year to spend a lot of time getting these models in front of people and thinking about the stories that those models can tell us. So that's it for me. There's some of our collaborators. And now I will stop sharing and pass it over to Tim.
Okay, thanks, Graham. So I'm hoping to keep my presentation relatively short, just 8 slides, and I really want to sort of give the broader context perhaps to a lot of the work that we do in the Delta, and that is the basin itself. And so, we often hear about, some of the challenges associated with operating E.B. Campbell Dam, and of course there are issues that happen further upstream that lead to some of those problems at E.B. Campbell Dam that affect the Delta. And so before we get into the a specific discussion about flows coming from E.B. Campbell, I thought we'd sort of zoom out, so to speak, and look at the basin as a whole. And I apologize for those of you that were at the workshop yesterday. Some of this may be a bit repetitive. You may have had this context already given to you through the visualization tool that was presented yesterday. But the context that I'm operating in is one of environmental flows, and so environmental flows refer to the amount, the timing, and the quality of water that's required to sustain the ecology of a system. And we can often think about this in terms of the hydrograph. You have low and high water at different times of year, and of course plants and animals are going to be adapted to that water rising and falling as it does. They'll sync their life cycle to match peaks and troughs in flows. And this leads to robust and resilient ecosystems that are able to sort of handle what we might consider potentially disruptive floods and droughts because of their adaptations. And so what happens is then when we alter these flows and change either the magnitude or the timing of when water arrives, the plants and animals and other organisms become disrupted as well. As a result, they may not reproduce, they may outright die, and as a result, their populations will be less sustainable. And so we see changes in ecosystem structure and function. And we can get clues to those changes just by looking at the hydrographs and how they've changed over time. And so the main point being that organisms have certain adaptations to a natural flow regime that can be disrupted by water resource development upstream. And of course, people also have adaptations to these flow regimes. And so one of the main sort of take-home messages that I want to leave you with as we enter a discussion about visualization and modeling tools is that the seasons matter. So for a long time, water managers were thinking mostly about minimum flows. Okay, and minimum flows are important, but minimum flows aren't the entire story. And the reason for that is there are times of the year when flows are quite low in rivers. Okay, and so that needs to be built into this sort of flow regime design or restoration. And this example that I'm showing here is for the Saskatchewan River Delta. So these are 2 years, just example years, one sort of in the pre-dam era and one in the post-dam era, showing how in the past you had very low and steady water levels in the winter that coincided with muskrat trapping season for people in the Delta. That was followed by ice breakup and high water levels for the spring and summer. People were ready for those high water levels. The animals were ready for those high water levels. It was a time of fishing in the river and the main lake, Cumberland Lake, and then slow and steady declines of water into the fall and back into winter that coincided with periods of waterfowl harvesting and other hunting and guiding activities. And so in a bad water year, what we might call a bad water year, what we have is erratic flows being released from upstream, leading to unstable ice formation. You still might have a spring melt peak of water, but it's very quick. So you see it comes and goes very quickly, unlike this good water year in the past. And as a result, that can actually lead to stranding or mortality of animals. It can lead to flooding of bird nests, for example. And that's because animals might get fooled into thinking that the water is going to be high and stable. They'll lay their eggs, for example, or place their nests close to the water line. And then we get a second flood peak coming that disrupts that activity. And so then throughout the late summer and early fall, we have this continual these low water events, often associated on a daily basis. As a result, these can lead to things like people's boats being stranded on shorelines. So all of it serves to cause major disruptions to the way people live their lives in this delta. So it's not just an animal problem, but it's also a people problem as well. But when we sort of zoom back out to the basin scale, we can start to see where some of these problems originate. Okay, And so what we've been doing with our environmental flows work is looking across the basin. So we have 33 different sites located from the Rocky Mountains down to Lake Winnipeg to try and understand how flows have changed through different parts of the basin. And what we're doing is we're comparing the measured flows. Okay, so those we can get just off the gauge data from the Water Survey of Canada for this time period of interest, 1979 to 2010. So we can pull that data directly. It's out there. It's what people have experienced in that 30-year period. And then what we do is we compare it to what are called naturalized flows. And so naturalized flows are basically flows that we would expect in the absence of any human development. Okay, so this is what the closest that we can expect to natural. And underlying that is mesh. So that's a model that will basically produce hydrographs, okay, expected hydrographs under different conditions. And so it's a model that starts with inputs. Basically imagine water raining on a drainage basin. That drainage basin has a certain shape to it. It has a certain type of land cover and soils. It might have glaciers in its headwaters. And as a result, mesh will then predict the discharge hydrograph based on those inputs. And it can do it with human activity included, like irrigation and hydropower, or it can do it with those influences removed. And when they're removed, we call that those naturalized flows. So it's our best estimate of what the water would look like if we didn't have dams, irrigation, cities, et cetera, using water upstream. And so this is an example of one of those gauges. This is the most downstream gauge in our set. So it's below Grand Rapids. So this is we can think of this as sort of the cumulative effect of everything that's happened upstream. And it's not a very pretty picture. So what you see is the naturalized flow. So mesh is telling us that on average, okay, so this is an average, not just a single year. On average, we should expect low and steady flows in the winter. We should expect a spring runoff peak, a very large spring runoff peak, and then a secondary peak coming from the Rocky Mountains, and then slow and steady decline into fall and winter. And so this is pretty close to what we see in the early part of some gauge records that might go back, for example, to 1913. Instead, what we see in the measured data, at least for this time period, is these erratic flows, okay? Much higher winter flows and lower summer flows, almost a complete absence of spring and summer flood peaks. And again, that's heavy control by of course, the Grand Rapids Dam at that most downstream location, but it also represents these cumulative effects coming from upstream. And so we can look at these changes on a gauge by gauge basis. This is very hard to visualize, but what we do is we use these sort of little pie charts. So anything you see in orange means that the flows that were measured in that period were actually below what mesh said should have happened. Anything in blue is flow that should be above, that was above what mesh thought should have happened. And we've got two periods, the ice off period and the ice on period. And so what you see is as you sort of move throughout the basin, you can start to see signals of different activities. And what we attribute this lots of orange in southern Alberta to is irrigation. Okay, so people are pulling water off. It's consumptive use. The water's not being returned to the river for the most part. And as a result, the measured flows are much lower, in some cases in both seasons, relative to the naturalized flows. As you move into different parts of the basin, you see different signals. So here now, we're looking at the Bow River. So you have some irrigation. You also have some hydropower as well. Ultimately, when the Bow and the Old Man River come together, this is sort of the cumulative signal from those two locations. We have below naturalized flow in the ice-off period. Okay, so that's the reduction in flood peaks. And then we have above naturalized an above naturalized signal in the winter. Okay, again, that's a hydropower signal, so capture of water in the spring and summer, storage and release in the winter. And we can look at other parts of the basin. So here's the Red Deer. You actually see blue, so you have more water than expected in both ice off and ice on, and that's a bit difficult to explain. So that might be just a problem where the model is off slightly. but we take that to also be a hydropower signal as well. And then when we get further downstream, so now we've got the cumulative effects of all of these gauges down here at Saskatoon. And again, you see that summer storage, winter release fingerprint associated with that gauge. North Saskatchewan, less regulated by dams except in its headwaters. And again, we see lots of blue, so there's more water. But ultimately, when we go further downstream, so now we're combining the North and South Saskatchewan basins, we still see the dominance of this summer storage and winter release signal. Okay, so once we get down to the delta and beyond, and so that's really the dominant signal that we're seeing as we move further downstream, and it speaks to the controls that are present in the system, and that includes Gardner Dam and Lake Diefenbaker. And so often we talk about E.B. Campbell as being a problem, and it is for hydropeaking, of course. Everyone's well aware of that. But when it comes to these seasonal flows, the big player here is Lake Diefenbaker. Okay, so these bubbles are scaled according to approximate volumes. Okay, so we have Tobin Lake itself, the storage of Tobin Lake, we know is much smaller than that of Lake Diefenbaker. So that means that what we do at Gardner Dam has a huge influence on the delta. And we can think about removals of water for irrigation further upstream in Alberta, and this bubble is quite large. Okay, it's almost as big as the storage in Tobin Lake. And of course, Tobin Lake isn't removing the water; it's simply potentially altering the seasonal timing and the daily timing. And then the last thing we need to think about is future irrigation. So the irrigation expansion that's proposed for Lake Diefenbaker is going to make irrigations approach the scale of water use for Alberta. And so this is something we really need to think about when it comes to seasonal timing of that water release. And so the last slide here, just thinking about the future. The other thing that we can do with the mesh model is to actually think into the future. And based on some of those inputs, right? So which would be the the climate data, for example, in particular, and how climate might change associated with global warming, how that might change precipitation, how it might change the relative proportion of snow versus rain, for example, is going to affect the amount and timing of water that comes into the system. And so to do that, we can actually start to think about what we might be dealing with in an average year in the future. So again, these are averages, not a single year. We expect year-to-year variation in all of these things, but on average, so this light blue line here is the plot of the naturalized flows from 1979 to 2010 versus the pink, which is the observed flows. Okay, so this big reduction. So, but we can also think about how the naturalized flows will change into the future. So we have these other two blue lines, one of which is the 2025 to 2055 period, and the other is the 2070 to 2100 period. And so that's a long way in the future, but it suggests that what we're faced with are earlier spring peak flows. Okay, so the dark blue line here happening earlier in a typical year, and then lower summer flows. Okay, so a reduction, you look at these three blue lines, reduced summer flows into the system. And so that's going to put pressure on the irrigators for their water. It's certainly going to put pressure on the delta in terms of meeting its environmental flow needs. So that's all for me. Thanks for that. Graham, you're on mute.
Thanks so much, Tim. If you have questions, please write them down and we'll hold them for the end so that we have time for a fulsome discussion. We'll go to Pouya next. So Pouya, you can share your screen.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Pouya Sabokruhie. I did this work with my supervisor, Carl Lindenschmidt. So, and the title of our study is like 2D hydraulic model to examine water and sediment availability in an inland delta. So, The region where we are doing our studies, like Saskatchewan River Delta. You can see a figure we have here from NASA. This is like an important region for us to study. The main reason for that is like it's largest inland fresh delta in North America, and it's home to diverse range of animals, fish, and birds, and also communities living around this delta. So there is another figure about the exact location that we are doing the modeling for. So the reason that we're doing this modeling is because of some problems that people around are facing. So mainly flow patterns were affected by dams. So as Tim was talking about it, so it's just not E.B. Campbell Dam, also Gardner Dam. So they kind of have an effect like domino, you know, like you're gonna, if you have a problem at Gardner Dam, it's kind of gonna continue up until here. Also, as also Tim showed, abnormal flow fluctuations, and also some problems with sediment transfer, because like the dam is kind of storing the sediment and they're not getting enough sediment over there. And also another problem that we're looking for some solution for it is like the size and extent and depth of Cumberland Lake has reduced. So our objectives here, the main objective we have is that we're not just doing a normal modeling. So we're basically looking to involve the community members and kind of team up with them. So they are involved in almost all the aspects of our modeling team, from like giving ideas, scenarios, calibrating, and seeing the results. And we also going to do some scenarios to see the effect on the delta. So the modeling package that we're using is HECRAS, and the latest version of HECRAS 6.2. We are doing like a 2D modeling over 1D. So basically the reasons we are doing a 2D modeling, it's like the main reason, delta is a pretty flat area. So if you want to do a 1D modeling, you need to have cross sections, as you can see here. But because delta is pretty flat and you're going to get water kind of all over, the cross sections, they can't characterize what's happening inside the delta. So we are doing a 2D modeling. Another main important reason is that if you run a model in 2D, you can get better visualized and animated results. So this is kind of what community was asking for, and they were felt more involved to see the results in animated and visualized way. So this model has many features. If I want to show some, we have the ability to track water depths all around the delta at the locations that we're modeling. We can track water level at them. We can also see velocity, shear stress, and many others. And here I have a figure for shear stress. So this map is mainly can be used for the sediment transport. So as I mentioned, after dam kind of getting lots of sediment. So after this, water is kind of eroding up until here. As you can see, the spots that are more reddish, they kind of, I can say, more powerful to erode sediments from the bed. So that's kind of same as what community members were reporting to us. So at this area, we are seeing more erosion, and probably these materials and sediments are depositing all around here. So currently we calibrated our model, and as you can see, we have one gauge almost here. So this is like the HECRAS simulated ones with exact observed ones at Saskatchewan River below Tobin Lake. You can see, I guess these numbers looks pretty good for me. So as I mentioned, our plan was to get some scenarios from the community members and run them. So basically they can get an idea if what they're proposing is gonna work or no. So they were mentioning about a weir to raise the water depths in the Cumberland Lake. So as they mentioned, we added a weir to see if actually it can be helpful or no. And as you can see, we observed that adding a weir can approximately raise the water depths around 10 to 15 centimeters. So currently, the method that we are developing the model is knowledge exchange with community members. We are kind of doing back and forth with them. We are working on it, show it to them, getting some comments and working more on it. And I also want to show you the video of the model, that how actually it visualized the results, and which is kind of interesting for the community members. We can also have like the Google Maps on it to make it easier, and we can track water depths all around. We can see the velocity, where is water is faster, and basically we also can later develop flow hazard maps based on this model too. Yep, this was my presentation, and I will be happy to answer questions at the end. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Pouya. And we'll hand it over to Ana-Piecie.
Thank you, Graham. Just gonna share some slides here as well. All right, so hi everybody. For anybody who hasn't met me before, yeah, I'm Ana-Piecie de Plessis, but please feel free to call me AP. I work within IMPC and the computer science department at the U of S under Dr. Carl Goodwin, who's here today as well. And thanks, Graham, for the opportunity to join in this discussion today. So, sorry, just, there we go. With the Campbell flow visualization tool, the inception of this tool kind of came about after a conversation between Dr. Goodwin and SaskPower, where it was noted that sort of some kind of digital visualization tool would be of value in supporting conversations between different stakeholders around the Delta. And then once I came on board last year, we started by producing a very simple tool that just kind of took average daily data from the gauges closest to EP Campbell. And we had some features that sort of changed size depending on the value of the outflow. And then that was our jumping off point for talking with various stakeholders and a sort of iterative process of adjusting the tool to get closer to what all these different groups need. So I'd like to give you a few of the highlights from those conversations. And then as we go through the tool, you'll see where we've incorporated those ideas. So right at the beginning, we started talking with people who live in the Delta, and they told us about how they see water level fluctuations within a day, not just between days. And so it was sort of, immediately obvious that we needed higher resolution data than just those average daily values. They also highlighted the need for photos within the tool to really help show what the experience is like on the ground, living with the effects of those fluctuations every day. Then we also talked with SaskPower, and talking with them really highlighted that need, similar to what Tim was saying, to show the effects of operations upstream of EP Campbell, because there's so much more impacting what's happening at the Delta. And so particularly they wanted to see kind of the effects of Gardner Dam and the roles of the South and North Saskatchewan in how much water is available and sort of when it's available to the Delta. We also discussed the link between hydro peaking and power demand in the province, and They were very great and provided us with some data about that demand. And then we've also been touching base with the Water Security Agency about improving our data, particularly around inflow. And of course, Tim and Graham have shared so much of their knowledge and data about the Delta to help move this tool forward as well. And then I also had the opportunity to visit Cumberland House towards the end of last year, and listening to people's experiences made things like the kind of map that we use in the tool so much more important. You know, a very memorable comment from when I was there was that the Delta is dying because it's being treated like a river. The Delta is dying and becoming a river. Now, that was a difference I hadn't fully appreciated before, and so it really struck with me. And so we need to make sure that we showed a level of detail in the map, the Delta, that, you know, most digital maps don't. We needed to make sure that this huge area wasn't being artificially compressed by design choices, you know. So the tool that you're going to see today is the product of many perspectives. And for all of you here today that have been a part of that process, thank you so much for your feedback and help in shaping the tool along the way. And for those of you for whom this is a completely new tool, now you have some background information on the conversation behind the tool. And next, we're going to go through some of the sort of key features of the tool itself. So we'll jump into it. I'm just going to be showing snapshots of the tool today, but the system is live, and I'll be sharing the link at the end of today's presentation. But if you were to go to that link, this is what you would see. So one of the questions that popped up while developing this tool was commonly, you know, around what's happening in the dam right now. So we're going to take a look at the part of the tool that tells you exactly that. In the top right of the tool, we have what we call a recent data chart. And so in the section, you can see roughly the last 48 hours of inflow, outflow, and elevation data for Tobin Lake. This data is collected hourly from Environment Canada and will show the most recent information available. And I'll mention something about the inflow in a little bit, but I took this snapshot this morning. So just as a quick note, the purple line at the bottom shows elevation changes at Tobin Lake, and that the value is in meters, but the changes that you see are really just a few centimeters. What we're really going to focus on is the current flow. So in the top half of the chart, we have two lines talking about flow, both measured in cubic meters per second, or CMS. The light blue line shows inflow as measured below the forks currently, though we are looking to change this to be a water balance at Cadet Reservoir for better accuracy, because it was highlighted earlier this year that the gauge below the forks does have some issues. And then the green line shows outflow as measured below Tobin Lake, so the same gauge that Pouya was mentioning in his model there. When you go to the site, you can explore the actual values more closely by hovering over the lines, but all I want you to note for now is that inflow is, you know, a fairly consistent line, and outflow fluctuates around that line. If you were to average out the green line, it would follow inflow as you would expect from a run-of-the-river facility. But when you look at this resolution, we can see that hydro peaking, and we can see that really there's a big difference when you talk about daily averages versus hourly data. And so you'll see a little bit later in the tool, and Tim has presented about this previously, the shape that we see in that green outflow line is the same shape we see if we plot water levels at the same location. And so as the water moves through the delta, that shape becomes a bit less defined, but it can still help give you an idea of what to expect. So we're hoping that this part of the tool will kind of be a bit like how people living on the coast might look to what the tide forecast is, and say, okay, well, this is what's happening at the dam right now. Based on what I've seen before in the past and what I know about the conditions in the delta right now, I could probably expect it to look like this, you know, in 2 days at my place. So, and then I just want to also, show this just for comparison. It's a snapshot of the tool from around the 7th and 8th of March. And I just wanted to show that, you know, hydro peaking is something we see throughout the year, summer or winter. But though, what if you're interested in more than just like the last 48 hours? Well, then we can also look at that. We have a section of the tool that we call the historical chart section. So here you'll find information about the flow into and out of Tobin Lake from 2000 onwards. This is all data taken from Environment Canada. So there are some gaps where gauges stopped working or before gauges was installed, but there's still a lot that we can see. And most of the data, except for the very recent stuff, has all been corrected by Environment Canada as well. So here we have the last 22 years of data. In this chart, we have the inflow and the outflow to Tobin Lake, which are, again, the light blue and green lines, same as the previous chart. And then we also have a breakdown of inflow into, we have a breakdown of the inflow based on the North or South Saskatchewan. The purple space under the blue line shows water from the North Saskatchewan, and that sort of lime yellow color between the purple and the blue line shows the proportion of water coming from the South Saskatchewan. So spring is always an interesting time of year for the Delta. So we're going to take a look at the last sort of 3 months here. For anyone who attended the presentation of the last Delta Dialogue meeting, you can see that that false inflow spike in March has been corrected by Environment Canada, and the data in the tool has been updated accordingly. But what we can see now is that a lot of the water that's been coming to the Delta over the last 3 months comes from the North Saskatchewan, represented in purple there. And again, you can kind of see the hydro peaking all throughout. What's also really interesting to look at is sort of how does that proportion of water from the North or South Saskatchewan change over the seasons? So here we're looking at sort of the last 2 years of data. Now with last year being so dry, the summer spike inflow was quite subdued, so I've tried to point out the summers here. What you can see is that in the summer, most of the water is coming from the North Saskatchewan River. It's a much more natural system, as Tim mentioned earlier, so we do still see those seasonal fluctuations, and it's usually the North Saskatchewan that sort of kickstarts that spring flood. When you look at the spaces between the summers though, you can see that we have 2 or 3 times as much water coming from the South Saskatchewan and Gardner Dam as we see from the north. So this means that the Delta is sometimes getting, double the amount of water it would expect under natural conditions in the wintertime. And now something else that we can do with the chart section is we can expand the historical chart to reveal more data. And so when we do this, we get to see that same inflow and outflow data that we had before, but now we also have access to water levels below the dam, provincial power demand data, and also the elevation and outflow of Lake Diefenbaker. Though that outflow is at Saskatoon, so any sort of hydro peaking or patterns like that get washed out quite a bit. I'm not going to go into too much of that data, but what I did want to show is a sort of segment from April 2020. Once again, we can see that hydro peaking behavior in the outflow in that green line at the top. In the second row, we see the water levels at that same gauge, and we can see that they follow that pattern of outflow, changing by about 1 meter or more, usually in an hour or two. And in that third row, we see the reason behind these fluctuations, provincial power needs. So E.B. Campbell supplies a fraction of this total power. Like my estimate right now, like knowing what I know is about 5%, but that changes depending on conditions. But what's really important here is not so much the volume, but the pattern. There are times when power demand is high and other times when it's low, and E.B. Campbell has to contribute to those needs. So when you see something like that, it becomes easier to understand why batteries are becoming a bigger part of the hydro conversation. But I won't get into that now, but it's there's some exciting stuff out there. And so charts aren't always the best way to tell stories. So we also want to have features that showed what those numbers mean when you zoom into the Delta. What does it look like on the ground? So we have a map feature showing the Delta. And this is that updated map that I was kind of talking about that better represents the breadth of the Delta. And of course, this view it's only looking at a part of the Delta. The live tool shows much more than what you can see here, but what we're looking at here is Tobin Lake is kind of peeking out of that bottom left, and Cumberland Lake is sitting on the right. And we can also zoom into places like Cumberland House. And then based on the time frame that you have selected in that historical chart, you'll find markers on the map indicating locations where photos are available from that time frame. So in this particular example, we're looking at a span of time from February 2018 to February 2020. But all of these photos are kind of from the same point in time. But say we want to look at this marker. If we clicked on it, we'd see this photo. And what this could then spark is, stories about, what were the conditions like at that time? Are they good for bird life? What did people notice about, the hatching rates that year? And we also get a snapshot of what those conditions were like at the dam, based with those dam icons on the left. but they show sort of daily average inflow, outflow, elevation, and power generation. But it's at least a talking point. And then just lastly, one other thing that I wanted to point out in the map is these sort of numbered markers. If you click on those, you get a cross section of that location in the delta with sort of an estimated water level based on outflow for E.B. Campbell. But this is based on a very simple formula with data from 2020. We are looking to refine this by working with Pouya and his model, and hopefully making this much more dynamic. Because as Pouya was talking about, something that we came across earlier is, when you get to the top of those levees, then it's very chaotic to try and say what's actually happening in the delta. So that's the tour of the E.B. Campbell visualization tool. And I'd really like to invite you to go to the site and explore the tool for yourself after the panel. But if you have any questions about anything we looked at today, or anything else in the tool, please feel free to reach out to me. We're always looking for feedback.